many ways, Victoria Harbour is the heart of Hong Kong and key to its transformation from a barren backwater island to a global powerhouse of trade and finance. The waterway separates the island of Hong Kong from Kowloon, with high-rise offices and towering apartments on either side. In addition to the city's impressive densely packed skyscrapers, there's another striking feature. There are no bridges. Other islands in the area have bridges. So what then is unique about Hong Kong Island that makes it bridgeless? If we view the modern-day landscape, it might be easy to conclude that there is simply no space for a bridge. While that is true, if we look at things from a more historical perspective, there are more reasons for the island's lack of bridges than meet the eye. But before we get into all that, let's take a look at how things now stand in 2023. Hong Kong is a dense city with a population of close to 7.5 million residents, most of whom live in high-rise apartment buildings. The towers extend up from everywhere, and walking through the city feels like walking through a man-made valley with vertical residential walls. There are wide streets and narrow connecting alleys. Hong Kong is semi-tropical, and its location can lead it to be routinely hit by typhoons and intense rain. When the weather closes in, there are fewer people on the streets. Still some, though. As a former British colony, Hong Kong has a mix of British and Chinese influence, though in recent years it has taken on a bit less of the British flavor. One factor in Hong Kong's density is that there is not much space to build, and the city is wedged between Victoria Harbour on one side and Victoria Peak on the other. Both the harbour and the peak are named for Her Majesty, Queen Victoria, who reigned over Britain and its colonies from 1837 to 1901. Back on the topic of bridges, considering modern-day land use, one might conclude that bridge on-ramps and off-ramps would take up too much valuable real estate. Hong Kong is clearly built up now with space at a premium, but that wasn't always the case. There have been a number of land reclamation projects over the years, yet none of the man-made land was used to create space for bridge access. In fact, a bridge proposal was developed in 1961 and was projected to cost less than a competing tunnel proposal. But in the end, the tunnel was selected. There are more than 500,000 registered vehicles in Hong Kong, but more than 90% of daily trips use some form of public transportation, including the MTR subway below ground or buses and trams above. To cross the harbor, there are 3 tunnels. However, ferry is the more authentic and more scenic option. Ferries run between Hong Kong Island and Kowloon daily, even in less than ideal weather. As I was riding a ferry across the harbor in driving rain, couldn't help but wonder why, unlike most other major cities, does Hong Kong have no bridges? So in order to get a more full understanding of the present, it's often useful to take a look back and see what brought us to the current moment. In the case of Hong Kong, people have been living in the area since the Neolithic period. But before British colonization in the mid-1800s, the island of Hong Kong was a sparsely populated island, one of many along the eastern coast of China. There were small farms and fishing villages, salt production, and local trade. Residents would cross from island to island on small wooden boats called sampan. During this period, a bridge would have faced a few obstacles to construction. The first being that, with a small population, a population who primarily fished, the little demand for a crossing could be met by individual boats or private ferries. The second obstacle was that the water in the harbor is relatively deep, averaging about 12 meters, and the harbor itself is about 1 kilometer wide. These realities would have challenged both engineers and builders of the time. Then, of course, there is the severe weather that a bridge would have to withstand. All these factors combined to make building a bridge an unnecessary and difficult undertaking. As China increased its trade with Europe, particularly exporting tea to Britain, Canton, just up the river from Hong Kong, became a hub for goods to move in and out of the country. Britain mounted a huge trade deficit exporting Chinese tea, and they sought to even the scales by importing opium from their Indian colonies to markets in China. The Chinese imperial authorities, recognizing the serious problems that the drug caused, banned the opium trade and threatened the death penalty for any who disobeyed the ban. As opium was Britain's most profitable commodity during the 19th century, the Crown imposed their will in a forceful encounter, which led to the Treaty of Nanking, requiring China to increase foreign trade and, crucially for our bridge interests, cede Hong Kong to British colonial rule. Initially, Britain only controlled Hong Kong Island, with neighboring Kowloon still a part of mainland China. There was concern among colonial officers that Kowloon was a place of vice, and there was hesitation to create a physical connection to the mainland. After 1860, Britain took control of Kowloon as well, bringing with it the circumstances that led to the infamous Kowloon Walled City, home to the Chinese consulate and outside of British jurisdiction. In the early years of British colonial rule, a major consideration was that any structure over the harbor absolutely must not block shipping. Ships brought with them trade and economic prosperity. Adding to that, the powerful British Navy's massive warships needed safe harbor to refit and resupply in the Far East, so any bridge built would need an exceptionally high clearance. The high clearance, combined with the depth of the channel, would have made building a bridge an impressive engineering feat for the time. Whatever the obstacle, or combination of obstacles that were at play, ultimately no bridge was built, despite the fact that this was a period where many iconic bridges were rising around the world. With the lack of a bridge, in 1870 an Englishman brought a boat from England and sailed it between Hong Kong and Kowloon, whenever he was in the mood. A few years later, in 1888, that boat was purchased by an Indian man, who then went on to found the Star Ferry Company. That same Star Ferry Company still runs to this day, with 2 ports on either side, operating rain or shine. Personally, I'm a fan of the ferry. As a visitor, unaccustomed to the harbor views, the ferry gives a moment to soak in the modern and natural landscape while having a chance to reflect on the 10 or so minutes it takes to make the crossing. I think even if I lived here, I wouldn't tire of looking out at the skyline. In the few days I was here on this visit, I took every opportunity to look out at the harbor, the buildings, and the mountains beyond. In recent years, the city has struggled with political and governance issues relating to the handover of power from Britain to China in 1997. The city feels different from when I last visited in 2018, and it's hard to say exactly why. Perhaps it has something to do with the nearly 500,000 permanent residents who left Hong Kong since 2020. Perhaps the effects of the pandemic and protests linger on, or perhaps it was simply the heavy rain on my visit that cast the city in a different light. Whatever the case, this was meant to be a transitional period for the city, as it adapts to new governance realities. And periods of change often do not go as smoothly as one might hope. It will be interesting to see what the years ahead have in store. Is a bridge in Hong Kong's future? We shall see.